Well, hello and welcome to all of you. This is one of those fabulous LFF Connects. Today with Nitin Sawhney, I'm Nikki Bedi. And if a neuroscientist were to map Nitin Sawhney's brain, they would find this inordinate amount of activity and super firing of synapses in areas that most of us can't absolutely access. And that partly explains why he is a polymath and can do so many things. He's a composer, he's a multi-instrumentalist, a producer, and he works across many, many disciplines. And it would be like me reading out a shopping list if I were to list them all, but TV, film, video games, dance and theatre, that's just a few of them. Am I embarrassing you, Nitin?
Always.
And then he has a fascination with maths and quantum physics. So he actually wrote an opera called Entanglement, which looked at Schrodinger's cat's paradox. And if you try and compete with this man on arithmetic, you will never, never win. But I'm interested to know whether there is an equation that explains your prodigious output.
No. Hello, by the way.
I think it's 24 hours minus sleep equals composition, because you do so much. So as a musician and a composer, you essentially have an emotional canvas, and then you turn feelings and thoughts into music for us. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because I've been talking a lot about translation. Yesterday I was with Chris Packham, and we were talking about...
He's the wildlife guy.
Yeah, and I was I wrote the music for a Sky Arts program called Animal Symphony. And we were talking about the idea of translation with animals and whether they derive pleasure from music at all. But I was also looking at how difficult it can be to translate, for example, I'm working with dance a lot, and to translate music into dance or vice versa is actually quite interesting, because you're dealing with two abstract narratives. So it's very different, the process, when you're working with theatre or film or if you're working with dance. They're all very different processes.
So we are focusing on your television and film scoring today and work today. So where do you begin in terms of work on a movie? Where does your thought process hinge itself?
Well, I think it largely starts with the director's vision, of course. And so you're working very closely with the director, and it's your job as a composer to realise their vision. But at the same time, they've asked you to come on board because of the way you compose music and the way you think about music. So you're constantly trying to evolve a vocabulary for the film that works with your sense of aesthetic taste, but at the same time you're ultimately serving the director. So there's a lot about vocabulary. You have to establish a vocabulary dialogue with the director and also with the characters and the narrative of the film.
Well, let's talk about Breathe, the BFI London Film Festival's opening night gala film, directed by the godfather of mocap, Andy Serkis, or Gollum to some people, or Caesar, depending on what you like. So it stars Andrew Garfield and Claire Foy, and a host of stars from the British acting firmament, and Tom Hollander, who in Bollywood terms did what we call a double role, didn't he? That's what they say in Bollywood.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, he very cleverly. Yeah, there was. I don't know how they.
I don't know how they did it. I wanted to ask you that.
Well, actually, I did do something like that once with a split screen thing. But I mean, this goes way beyond that. He's actually performing with himself in such an amazing way, and it's so believable. So yeah.
James Franco is doing the same thing in The Deuce right now, and instead of watching for the performances, I keep going, how are they doing that?
Yeah, Tom Hardy is the Cray twins as well.
Exactly.
It was really good. I love that.
So that's essentially the lineup. Maybe you can talk us through the story of Robin Cavendish.
Well, essentially, it's about Robin Cavendish, who was a disability rights activist, and what happened to him was that he got hit by the polio virus in 1959, and he came from a pretty privileged, well-to-do background, and was a very fit young man, and he had married the character of played by Claire Foy. So it's Andrew Garfield playing Robin Cavendish, and really it's about how he goes from this incredible whirlwind romance with Diana, and it's a true story, into this hell of being quadriplegic and being at a point where he can't do anything for himself, even breathe for himself. So he has a respirator by his bedside the whole time. And it really is about his journey to trying to get out of the hospital, trying to get out of the perception of other people as well, including a doctor who, and many other doctors, in fact, who thought that there could be no real life for somebody who was, or quality of life for anyone who was attached to a respirator at the time. So it's really a tale of resilience, of human perseverance, but it's also a great romance too.
So when we had, I don't know how many of you have actually seen the film yet, and I'm blind, so even if you put your hands up, I wouldn't be able to see you. It's so dark as well. But the opening of the film, when we're establishing their relationship, we have this music that is light and playful and slightly witty and really full of hope. And also, you know that they are English, this couple. How did you do that? What do you employ to do that?
Well, I employed talking a lot to Andy. So it was actually very much, it was in the dialogue that I had with Andy Serkis and think about, again, the building of the vocabulary of the film. And it was really about establishing this kind of almost fairy tale romance so that you really felt the change when he went through what he did.
But are there certain instruments that make something immediately, that transport us to England?
Strings do it.
They do, don't
Lots
they?
of strings. I think there's that, and then there's a kind of, I suppose it's just a sensibility or a certain type of flavour. I mean, for example, there's a garden party scene later on where I was asked to make it, I suppose, a bit like a Burt Bacharach track, and so I was listening a lot to Burt Bacharach's music, and again, it's a certain type of sound from a certain type of era or a certain era, but it's I think when you use strings, you avoid the pitfall of perhaps being anachronistic. If you're making music that is of a certain period, you can still evoke that without being too. If we'd used music off the time, then it would have felt strange and maybe distancing.
Because I, for a little while, thought, am I hearing an orchestra or is this just strings? So how much did you use of? Was it just strings?
Yeah.
And then the jazz bits differently, but for moments like that.
Well, then we used, for example, there's parts in the film where I worked with the Kansas Smitties, who are very brilliant young up and coming jazz musicians based in London, and they play at Ronnie Scott's. They're based at the Ronnie Scott's club, and they play on the soundtrack a lot as well. It was different things. I mean, at times there's programming which where I sometimes marry that up with strings as well, with the live performance. So the strings are actually recorded. What I mean is violins and violas and cellos and double basses. Those are all recorded at Air Studios. So I orchestrated those, and then some of it's programmed as well.
But then, do you, when you program, I'm sure that lots of you, when it comes to the Q&A, will have far more technical questions and far more in-depth questions. But when you are programming another set of instruments, do you need to know the notes and registers of every single instrument?
Oh yeah, you have to.
Does every composer know that though?
If you're an orchestrator, yeah. I mean, I'm an orchestrator as well, so I've worked a lot with orchestras. So you need to know the register of each of the individual instruments so that you can write for them. Absolutely.
So we also get to hear Bing Crosby and Grace Kelly's True Love. At one point, Lee Marvin's I Was Born Under a Wandering Star. I love that song. And I wonder, those obviously fit into the story in a certain way, but how do you then unify what you're doing around pieces that are hugely recognisable?
Right, well, so True Love and Wandering Star, Lee Marvin's version, they were both favourites of Robin Cavendish, of the main character. So because of that, they kind of really helped to define the vocabulary as well of the music. So, for example, I wrote a song quite early on, which appears in the end credits, and I kind of replicated that kind of feeling of True Love, and got in a singer who kind of had that crooning quality, and then there's Tina Grace from my band who also can do that, and they sung in the same kind of duet way as
Bing Crosby.
So it was kind of and then building around that theme. So I had that song, and then I worked around it and tried to establish that melody in many different places.
So there is a motif that runs throughout the film for each of the characters, or just for a couple of them?
It's more for different flavors. So, for example, there's Robin's spirit of adventure. At one point, there's also that kind of romance between Diana and Robin. So there's music for that, and so on. So it's much more about going with individual experiences and their attitudes to life.
I found it really interesting that when there was, for example, big emotion on the screen, and there was a lot of that, you seemed to choose a quietness in your music, whereas it could have been really bombastic or manipulative. You know how people just love to bring us in and make us emotional and cry, and you seem to have resisted that.
Well, I think at times, there are times when everyone's pulling at the heartstrings with the film, but then I think because Andrew Garfield and Claire Foy gave two amazing performances, and I think it was about really allowing those to breathe and there you go, but really have their own space and to make sure you don't swamp things. At the beginning with that opening montage, of course we are. There's hardly any dialogue at all, so it's really establishing everything, like I said, this kind of fairy tale romance feeling. But then after that, it's really about choosing the moments that you come in and really finding ways you can enhance what's going on. I'm not a big fan of underscoring everything in a film. I'm really into kind of choosing moments that heighten what's happening or add to what's happening in some way.
Because there is that hilarious scene as well when the twin brothers are taking a bed down the stairs.
Oh, yeah.
And we can hear music in the background, and it's piano.
Yeah.
That's you.
Yeah, that's me as well. Yeah.
But how do you choose what to do at a moment like that? Because you are informing us about something in the scene, that there might be music playing elsewhere, that it might be that. I mean, what was that about?
Well, to demystify that process.
Oh, don't take the magic away.
Okay, well, I won't then. I won't tell you. Sometimes, for example, you'll have a temp score as well. So that'll be the temp score is actually what's placed there by the director and the editor together to give you an idea of some of the music that they feel works. But then, quite often as a composer, you might say that I'll find something that does the same thing, but isn't similar to that at all. So that was pretty much what I do for some of these kind of more incidental moments, which don't have music very loud, but are just establishing a little bit of mood behind what's going on.
And have you ever, you don't need to name names, but have you ever had a temp score that was so hokey and mawkish that you just thought, I have to do something to improve upon this? Well, hopefully you always improve upon it.
Well, I wouldn't say, if I thought it was hokey and mawkish, then I'd probably think that the director wasn't very good or the editor wasn't very good, in which case I wouldn't.
Although they might just not have a sense of the music. I mean, they might be amazing filmmakers, but perhaps not get the right tone.
There is music that I think, generally I always hope that I can improve on or find a different way or find something else in what's going on that maybe hopefully they haven't thought of. So I'll always listen to the temp score and consider it, but it doesn't necessarily always inform what I'm doing.
There's a big scene in Germany where he's giving his speech. It's so rousing and so emotional and so powerful. And again, you chose not to have massive music there.
Yeah, again, I think it's also about letting the performance tell the story. And, I think sometimes when you are, if you're swamping words, you're really not giving them the space they deserve. And actually it can be distracting from what's happening. So I think it's very important to measure everything. If you're dealing with establishing shots like, big landscapes and so on, obviously you need to have, quite often you need big score and you need a big sound, but then, you need those more intimate moments to breathe, and occasionally it might be just the odd note on a piano or the odd note on from violin or whatever. And
you have a credit on this as engineer as well. Is that common?
Quite often these days, a lot of composers are actually working in the studio and doing a lot of their own work. But you work in teams. I mean, for example, I'm now doing jungle work for Warner Brothers with Andy as well. And in that particular film, there's a much bigger team of people who are involved in different aspects of the score. So it depends what you're doing. I mean, with this one, it was pretty much me with, I have a permanent engineer who I employ who's with me all the time, but I'm largely doing most of it myself, just sitting there and programming in Logic or scoring or putting into Sibelius and so on.
We're going to talk more about how you work in a little while.
Sure.
Let's move to a television series that you scored, which was called Wonders of the Monsoon. I just wonder, if you haven't seen those animals in the wild, if you haven't been out and felt or smelt or had all those senses, where you even begin to choose music for a scene like that?
I sound like a broken record when I say you talk to the directors as well, but because there are 4 different directors, I think, on that, as there were on the Human Planet series that I did, and you're working also with the series producer too. But I think it's also about really establishing a vocabulary again for the whole series. I really wanted to get across this sense of struggle and a sense of struggle for life. And there was something quite moving and quite engaging about that went beyond, for me, there was something quite metaphorical about watching this. And so it went beyond just scoring the action of what was happening, which I think sometimes is just tempting to do that. But I'm always looking for something a bit more emotional and which touches people. So also you heard a bansuri flute, which is a flute, Indian bamboo flute, in that, and that was played by Ashwin Srinivasan, who's a fantastic musician. Other than that, it was basically me at a keyboard. It sounds like there's strings there, but
it did.
But it's actually programmed strings on that particular one.
And then how, when you sit back and you've put all this together, do you actually know, yes, that's right, that's working? Do you just know from a feeling? Do you run it by people? How do you know? A
bit of both. I mean, you get to a point where you feel happy with what you've done, and then you run it by the director and the series producer as well. But it's also about really trying to build an arc with what's going on with everything. I mean, you're looking at how you develop and evolve a specific feeling and mood to everything that you do. Particularly a series like this. I mean, it's quite tricky because, for example, if you're doing a whole series for TV for the BBC, you're also trying to brand the series to some degree. So you might have the opening titles, and you want to maybe come back to the opening overture of what you've written. So there might be some references to that, and so you're constantly thinking about the vocabulary of sounds and the artillery of sounds that you've got at your disposal.
And so if for example, you have been given a cue, which is that scene, that's your cue, would it be that long? Would you get the whole scene as a cue? Yeah. Would there be sound on it in the beginning?
With that one, I don't know if there was, actually, with that particular one. So I kind of would... I would try to find something. I mean, again, it lends itself to percussion, but that's what I was programming up. But then, I'm also aware of trying to build in lots of different layers and keep it moving as well. And there's introduction of the different characters as well.
I remember, we're going to talk about Human Planet in a little while, but I remember, was it the narwhals?
Oh yeah, that's
that scene when they're in the water.
Yeah.
And there were splash sounds, and I remember thinking, so does he do the splashes? Or are the splashes there, and does he? I mean, I just didn't know.
Yeah, no. The splashes will be there, but you're working with them. However, with one of the episodes of the Human Planet, there were these women who were actually making rhythms or creating music by splashing their hands on the water, and so I used those rhythms in different ways and actually used them elsewhere in the series. So it was great to actually work closely with natural sound as well. I really like doing that. So you actually you're kind of interwoven or enmeshed with the vocabulary of music that you're choosing with the actual natural sounds that come from the film or the program that you work.
As somebody who doesn't really understand the animal kingdom or relate to it very deeply, I'm afraid, I find it staggering that if it's a human face, we can read so many different things. With an animal, I can't do that. So I give you more credit for creating personalities out of these animals without being, cute or anything like that. Is that a particular challenge?
I think this is what came up with the Animal Symphony score that I did, where there were two different briefs. One brief was that this should be music that elicits responses from animals, and then the other brief at the same time that I was also given on the same program was make sure it's accessible to people. So those two things are contradictory, because animals use sound for communication, reproduction, survival, whereas people use music largely for pleasure. And so what I'm trying to do is, I mean, for example, with a nightingale, a lot of the sounds are quite atonal, and they'll be using very strange rhythms, and they'll constantly be changing time signature what they're doing. In fact, the more complex the song of the nightingale is, the more likely the nightingale is to attract a mate. So in that respect, when I wrote music based on Nightingale song, it was very atonal and very complex. But that wouldn't and that's what we use. But then I had to balance that against creating music for the orchestra that would sound pleasant to us. And
let's talk about the Animal Symphony a little bit more then, because this is on Sky Arts, isn't it?
Yeah, it came out last year. Yeah.
Right, but you can still see that if you have access to Sky Arts and now, I think, can't you?
Sure. Maybe. Yeah. Possibly.
So was it actually a symphony?
Yeah, it was a symphony. So I was commissioned to write a symphony, and Chris Packham was involved, who's the wildlife guy, as you said, and we kind of spoke at length, and I got into the real science behind. It's a tricky one, this, because obviously one of the questions was, do animals derive pleasure from music? Which in a way is kind of a false question, it's a flawed question, because music is a human construct for humans. And so whether they derive pleasure from music or not, it doesn't really say much, because actually they may be responding to sound. It's just our perception that it's music. So
what would they be responding to? Rhythm?
Well, they can respond to lots of things. I mean, for example, chimpanzees have a part of the brain known as oscillatory phase lock, which is the same as human beings, and they will respond unfavorably to dissonance with musical intervals, whereas so they don't like heavy metal if it's got certain intervals, but then they'll respond really well to Mozart. So it's kind of so they can in a way you can kind of say yes, animals do derive pleasure from music or displeasure as well. So
do you have a very different method when you work on something for television as opposed to film for cinemas and theatres?
I think I don't really kind of distinguish. What I would do is I would say, what is the vocabulary of this project? Whether it's working with dance, theatre, film, my own albums, it's saying what is it that I'm trying to do here, and what's the appropriate mood, the appropriate vocabulary, and I'm very lucky in that I've kind of grown up as a classical pianist and a jazz pianist and then a flamenco guitarist, and I was in punk band, rock band, funk band, all kinds of things. And so from that point of view, I'm able to luckily draw on a lot of those different experiences. And so, I'll build vocabularies that are relevant to what I'm looking at and what I'm feeling, rather than trying to say, okay, I need to stamp my identity on this in such a way that everyone knows it's me. I don't really care about that so much. It will have my aesthetic judgment, but it will have the sounds that are relevant to whatever people are watching. As you can see, that's a very different palette of sounds to the breathed palette of sounds, and that for me is a good thing.
We'll move back to film now, and The Namesake, which was based on that beautiful book by Jhumpa Lahiri. And if you don't know the story, it's a Bengali family, the Gangulis, mother and father. They moved to New York with their children, and the parents hanker for what they've left behind in India, but they also want to give their children the best in life, and it sets up the most poignant, heartbreaking situations. Very, very moving. So using your Indian heritage and also your knowledge of Indian classical music, you infused that film with bits of both your worlds, I think. But did you?
Yeah, I think, although I've always said I try not to fuse music together based on geography or anything like that. I'm much more into the idea that you think of the whole world as your palette, as I've said to you before, I think, and that it's you kind of paint textures through sound, and and so it's about finding the right palette for this.
But for people who understand Indian classical music and the rhythms and the time cycles, is it very easy to use something that is completely Indian classical with something that, to our ears maybe, to ears like mine, for example, that sounds like it's a piece of just beautiful Western classical music? Where's the differentiation for us?
Well, that's a huge and very complicated question. I mean, for example, Indian classical music is much more the essential factors in Indian classical music, in Hindustani music, which is North Indian classical music, are that you have a drone, which would be played quite often by a tampura, and then you also have the tabla, which is quite often using different types of time cycles. So within Western classical music, you'll have mainly 4/4, 3/4, or 6/8, and so on. But within Indian classical music, you might have 17 beat cycles, 11 beat cycles, 10 beat cycles, 7s, and so on. So it can be quite complex mathematically as well, the way you're working. But then on top of that, with the rag system, which has what are known as 10 basic darts, which are the basis of how all the different rags work. I'm talking about Hindustani music now. You'll have lots of different moods, so you could kind of equate them to modal. You've got the Ionian and the Dorian and Phrygian and so on. So within, I'm getting a bit technical, but what I'm saying is that there is some degree of equivalence in the way you can translate from one to the other. But largely it's about respecting and understanding the nuances and differences that come from each way of looking at music.
So as a composer working on a film directed by Meera Nair, the money came from America, ostensibly, mostly. So you're doing a studio movie. Do they expect you to be able to do anything when you take on a job like that? How are you being employed?
Yeah, surprisingly, that happens a lot to me. But yeah, it can be the case that people will just say, "We want this now," and but that's. I'm very fortunate in that I've had a very wide and diverse upbringing musically. But it can be surprising what you're asked to do at the drop of a hat very quickly by a film director. But actually, I really enjoy those challenges.
I think the other thing that I'm getting at is, so an Indian audience are going to see that film with a certain level of expectation and knowledge and cultural background, and then a Western person or somebody who doesn't understand the music or the culture of India is going to see it. But you've got to tell the story for both sets of people. Is there a line between the two when you start composing, or do you just go for one feeling?
I think, for example, I probably wouldn't go into heavy-duty Indian classical technique with a film like that. It's also about making it accessible, and this is a film they wanted to, have its Fox Searchlight. They need it to be accessible to people, and so it's actually about building a vocabulary that reflects that too. So I'm not, with that I was using the tabla rhythm I was using, which is a simple 4-beat or 8-beat cycle. So it's not particularly complex, and again, it's I think it's Rag Yemen, which is a Lydian mode. It's quite accessible, and it works across the harmony that I'm using. So there's nothing there that I think kind of would alienate people. So I guess I am subconsciously thinking that way.
But could a non-Asian composer or somebody who didn't have your roots make a piece of music like that?
I've heard people do that. I have mixed feelings about when I hear people do that who don't have or haven't had a background or training or understanding of Indian classical music. I played tabla when I was young and sitar, and I think it's important to have at least some rudimentary understanding of rag as a system, which is very complex, and it sometimes sounds patronizing to my ears when I hear music composed by people who otherwise are pretty damn good composers within Western classical technique, but they don't really hear what you need to hear or understand what you need to understand. If you're going to employ Indian classical techniques, you really need to know what you're doing, I think. I feel that in a way.
So the Jungle Book Origins that you're working on again with Andy Serkis, and you've started work on that already, I understand.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
So is that meant to be in India, like the story was?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, it is. Yeah, although it's kind of a kind of imagined version of India. So it's kind of I think it's not a romanticized version, but it's a kind of larger than life version.
So will you be bringing Indian music into that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've brought in some great Indian classical players and musicians already, and some of the music, quite a lot of music has actually already been done for it, although we haven't actually got into the recording of the orchestra yet.
So Hollywood will get a massive dose of Indian classical music?
I wouldn't say that. I'd say that there are definitely elements in there.
I want them to.
It's definitely a strong influence on what's going on.
And when you watch a scene like that from The Namesake, because I don't know how many years ago that was released, but do you look back at your work and think, "Wow, that was lovely. That I got what I wanted out of that," or are you constantly looking and saying, "I'd do that differently now"?
I try not to look back too much.
Sorry about this then.
Yeah, no. I mean, as in, I don't look back judgmentally, is what I should have said. I think to myself, okay, well, that was who I was then, and that's what I did as a response to that. And that's generally how I like to live life. It's you look at what happens in that moment, and then you move on. And that's it, I guess. And musically, I think I've tried to do that a lot.
Human Planet, I mentioned it earlier. So the first time that I went and had the privilege of visiting Nitin's studio, he was scoring Human Planet. So that was the epic BBC TV series. And I got the impression that you hadn't slept for days. And that is possibly because you had a sleeping bag on the sofa I mean, maybe you like a nap, but is that how you work then? Will you just sleep in your studio?
Okay, just to establish what happened with the Human Planet series for the BBC, it was I had 8 weeks to write the music for all 8 episodes of the Human Planet series, and that involved doing about 50 odd minutes of orchestration per week. So it's an album's worth of orchestral score per week. So we had to then go off to Wales at the end of each week and record that with the National Orchestra of Wales and mix it in 5.1 for broadcast. And on top of that, I had 4 different directors who wanted 4 different things, plus a series producer who wanted me to brand the entire series. And I was given notes during the course of that week. So I didn't sleep. I didn't actually do anything apart from write music. And I ended up with pneumonia at the end of it. So it's kind of, it is really demanding when you have something like that. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't know if I could do that again. It was really full on because, and I love the result and I love the series. It was a really beautiful series. It was, again, it was about human diversity and experience and resilience across the world. And it was such a celebration of human possibility. And I think, a series like that is so important these days, or at any time. But there were incredible moments in that, which stunned me, in so many ways that people could do some of the things that I was seeing, and lived in the way that I was seeing. But that was very inspiring. That kept me going, and that probably allowed me to kind of have so many sleepless nights.
Okay, so that's not your normal working.
That would be insane. It's insane. That much orchestration per week, 50 minutes. To do an album of orchestral music a week is, I honestly don't recommend it to anyone.
And in a more general sense then, do you do that thing of if the muse takes you, that's it, you lock yourself away in your studio and you work out your creative ideas? Or do you have a far more sort of, I don't know, punctuated day like normal people do? You get up, you have breakfast, and then you do a few hours, and then you go for lunch, and then you have another few hours, and then you watch EastEnders.
I don't normally do that, but no. What I would do is sometimes I try to do that. That in some ways would be an ideal situation, but it invariably ends up something else, which is that you keep going until you get the job done. So it's being a composer, you have an obligation to hit deadlines and to make sure that you do the very best job you can every single time, and so. You don't compromise on that. That needs to happen, but it's just you have to also be careful about what you take and how much you take on.
John Hurt's voiceover, does that come in before you compose the music, or did he use his voice along with your music? I'm interested to know how commentary works.
So so I brought John in on this because I loved John's voice, and Dale Templer, who was the series producer for the Human Planet series, she was looking for a voice at the time, and David Attenborough he wasn't available for it anyway, but they were looking for someone who would be an equivalent, and I thought of John, and he did such a great job. But he had my music, I think, in a very rough edit of it, or rough mix of it. So he kind of had that as a reference, but I think largely he was just kind of working to direction at the time. But yeah, it's quite emotional for me to hear that, because obviously I knew John well, and it was very tragic when he passed away.
You scored for animals, humans, various acts of nature, violent and lovely, in that series. What's the hardest thing?
What, in scoring?
Yeah, well, when you're doing a project like that with nature at its core and people at its core who are out in the wilds and doing things they're not necessarily in cities.
I think it's to be honest enough to represent them when they need to be represented. I mean, for example, there was a particular tribe, I won't go into the detail, who hadn't really been seen by people before, and there was footage, and they wanted me to score it in a certain way, and I felt a great deal of reluctance to do that, because I thought, why would I want to stamp my personality or the personality of this series on people who, don't they have their own world, we don't know them, so we're kind of stamping something on these people, and I felt really uncomfortable with it, and I expressed that at the time to Dale, and she got it, and we talked for quite a while, and we kind of in the end I said, look, I prefer not to score it. If you want to actually find something within what I've done to put on that scene, then I think that's probably a better way to go, because I just feel uncomfortable trying to put something that I don't know them. I don't know who they are or anything about them. There's no knowledge to be gleaned about them. So I kind of so that was a difficult one for me.
And that's because they weren't part of that process. Like, for example, if you were filming people who signed a release form and were aware what TV was, and so your conscience stood out. And did you win the argument?
They did their own thing on it.
Oh, did they? You didn't do it in it?
No, I didn't do that. They used my music, but it was from something else that I'd done.
Oh,
what I was saying was I just would struggle. It was one scene, but I would. And it's one scene out of 400 views that I did, but it's just at certain times you just think I don't know, I've got nothing, I don't know how I would do that, and I don't want to manipulate people into having an opinion on people that have no say in how they're being perceived.
A theme that ran throughout the series. How quickly did you come up with that?
Actually, that was fortunate, because it was pretty much the first thing that came up. So I kind of wrote that quite early on, and then I kind of built around that. So it was actually about looking for ways in which you do that. But yeah, I think it's interesting, because you're trying to find build a vocabulary. I think you have to work very closely with the series producer. You have to work very closely with the directors. And you also have to really find your way in and emotionally find your own way into what's going on. So all of that is very important. You're trying to fulfill your own vision as well as everyone else's.
But can it then end up being music by committee?
Well, that's what you have to try and avoid. And that's very important, because you have to believe in what vocabulary you're building, and then it's more a case of getting approved by people, so they are, as soon as they do approve that, then you can follow through with it and have confidence that you're going a direction that isn't going to upset anyone or that feels appropriate to the other people you're working with.
So when you were sitting ready to score Breathe, or you'd scored parts, were you in a room in an edit suite or in your studio with Andy Serkis, the director?
Absolutely. I mean, you also have to be aware that Jonathan Cavendish, who's Robin Cavendish's son, he's a
filmmaker himself, isn't he?
Is one of the producers of Breathe. So from that point of view, it was quite tricky because I'm also thinking, okay, here's somebody who's got a very deep emotional investment in the film, and he's around. I mean, he comes to the studio and he's talking through what's going on and listening to the music, and so, you know, that's a very charged situation in a way. But then that's, you know, that's part of the challenge of doing it.
But one director that you couldn't have had in the edit suite or in your studio with you was Alfred Hitchcock, could you?
No.
And you scored a silent film of his called The Lodger.
That's right, yeah.
So as somebody who has heard Bernard Herrmann scores most of their life, I would imagine, you were very familiar with the music that Hitchcock chose. Was that a huge challenge? Was it slightly frightening even?
It was. I wouldn't say it was frightening, but it was a huge challenge, and I felt a great deal of responsibility. I mean, the BFI asked me to do it, and it was it's interesting because it's also working with the London Symphony Orchestra, and I'd worked with them quite a bit. I'd written 2 silent movies before, written scores for 2 silent movies. One was A Throw of Dice by Franz Osten, who was a German director, and but it was based in India. And then another one was by the Japanese director Niruse, which is called Yugoto no Yume, and which means sleepless nights, and or night of sleepless dreams or endless dreams or something.
Okay.
And that. I mean, it was always lovely to work with the London Symphony Orchestra, but the Hitchcock film was the first time I'd actually conducted the London Symphony Orchestra.
Yes, shall we talk about this for a minute? How can somebody who hasn't been studying conducting most of their life just decide, well, I'm going to conduct this?
Well, I did study at the Royal Academy not at the Royal Academy, with two lecturers at the Royal Academy, George Hurst and Denise Ham.
No, but that was just for this film. It's not in your past.
No, it wasn't in my past, but I'd worked a lot with orchestras, and I love, you know, I love orchestral music, and I'd always been a big fan of great conductors as well. And in fact, it's interesting because Bernard Herrmann wanted to see himself as a great conductor rather than a great composer. But yeah, it was really interesting actually going through that process and recognizing also how many kind of weird gestures quite a lot of conductors do that don't mean anything at all.
Like what?
Well, yeah. I mean, well, is
it a waving?
Well, basically, when you're conducting, it's a lot of it's about what happens in front of you rather than what happens behind you. And a lot of conductors will do certain things which I kind of find bizarre, which don't mean much, and won't mean much to the orchestra either. So I mean, this hand, the right hand, is generally for keeping time, and also if you want things to. I mean, maybe if you want more legato passages, you might actually make larger movements. If you're doing staccato conducting, then you know, or you're conducting to a click, then you keep your movements very tight and very small, and then you use this hand really for dynamics, and you cue with your eyes. So you're using your, you know, if you want more, you just basically do that, and less if you know. So it's kind of, there isn't. Because the dynamics I've written into the page anyway, and the articulation and so on, a lot of what's going on, a lot of the cue points are even written into the page. So you know, it's interesting when you go into conducting, when you get into conducting properly in front of an audience, you know, it's a very different process to what you're thinking about when you're scoring it.
Did you have fun making
Yeah,
that?
it's great. Yeah, I mean, it's really nice. There's no director looking at me.
Exactly.
He's dead. So yeah, but it was it was a lot of fun because it was about really again, this was really nice because it's a chance to build your own vocabulary, and it's kind of some of it's homage to Bernard Herrmann, but at the same time it's older and it's more naive, and obviously you know, you haven't got that sophistication of cinematography and directorial brilliance that Hitchcock established over time. So there's a kind of real simplicity and naivety and innocence to this as well, which is something I want to reflect by keeping it kind of, in a way, quite almost childlike in some of the ways I'm doing things.
And that was Ivor Novello.
Yeah, that was actually Ivor Novello. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's quite trippy, isn't it?
The real one.
Yeah. Would you tell us perhaps what piece of technology you couldn't live without for scoring?
Oh wow. Yeah, probably Logic. Probably Logic, because it actually enables me to mock up orchestral pieces, and sometimes I'll, they work so well that actually, occasionally I'll just leave them as they are and we don't record them. So that has happened, but sometimes it always helps to mock things up in Logic, because you really do get to hear how the score is going to sound with the film.
You've scored, how many films have you scored altogether?
Around 60.
60, yes.
Like that, yeah.
So amongst that, is there a Bollywood movie?
No. Well, no, there isn't.
So I had two very odd questions. So in terms of Bollywood, because it's such a massive industry, the Hindi film industry, and music sells the film before the film is sold on anything else, really. I mean, yeah, you've got to have your stars. But has that ever attracted you? Have people asked you to do anything in terms of Hindi cinema?
Yeah, they have actually, and there's a couple of things I'm talking about that I'm allowed to mention. But
are you going to knock R Rahman off his perch?
No, and actually A.R. Rahman's a really lovely guy.
Oh no, I know that. I do know him personally. He would laugh if I was saying that, I promise you.
No, he was actually years ago. He came round to my then kind of flat that I shared with 4 other people, and he came round, and I was doing a remix for him back in the 90s, I think mid 90s or early 90s, and I thought no one would know who he was, so I decided, in my naivety, to take him to a local Indian restaurant. And I went there, and we sat down at the table, and this waiter just came up, and I noticed this. He came up like this dark shadow, a bit like the lodger actually, and just stood there and stared at him for some time. And I looked around, and he was just fixated, and all he was repeating over and over was, "You are A.R. Rahman." And he didn't move for some time, and at the end of this kind of very long process, he kind of then just ran out of the room before we'd actually placed an order or anything, or even asked for the menus. And then literally about 5 minutes later, his entire family, all of his friends, relatives, they were all gathered round. And I felt really embarrassed, because I was just thinking, I'll take him to a quiet little Indian restaurant where no one will know who the hell he is. He's just a composer, for God's sake. Who's to know? But
absolute giga-star composer. Yeah. So maybe some Hindi cinema on the way. And the other question was, would you ever be willing to write for a musical, like a big West End musical? I just interviewed Tim Minchin this week, right. Matilda, Groundhog Day, and then in the same studio, David Bryan from Bon Jovi, who did Memphis and now The Toxic Avenger. You couldn't have 2 more different composers in a room, but it did make me sort of think, can anybody do it?
I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I've never done anything like that.
Would you be interested, though?
I've got the weirdest story about that.
Come on, we want stories.
Well, years ago, Vikas Swarup actually came to my house. The writer of Q&A, which went on to become a film. I'll tell you what film it was shortly. But he came around a long time ago and asked me if I'd be interested in writing the music for his book if it ever became a film. And he was just talking to me about that, and we hung out, had a really great dinner, and he was a really nice guy. And I was so into his book Q&A, I thought, you know what, I'm going to buy the theatre rights to it with Tanika Gupta. Right. And we actually bought the theatre rights. We had them for about 3 years and couldn't interest anyone in making this theatrical production of this book Q&A, and then we let it go, and it went on that year to become Slumdog Millionaire. So we owned the theatre rights for that for quite a while. But yeah, it was an amazing book. I remember kind of reading that and thinking, oh, that'd make a great West End musical. No one else thought that. But yeah, I mean, I think, in that respect, I've just turned my latest album into fully with the help of Sadler's Wells, who produced it. It's now become a fully choreographed show, which had its world premiere in Luxembourg last week. and that's beautifully choreographed by Wang Ramirez, who are an amazing dance duo.
And they're dancing together throughout this whole piece. So is it your whole album?
Yeah, it's my entire album, and it's beautifully staged, and it's going to be touring, and so.
When do we get it here?
I think sometime next year it's going to be at Sadler's Wells, and then it'll go on to quite a few different venues around the world.
Nitin Sawhney, we could talk for so much longer, but I think it's time to ask the audience if they have any questions for you.
Sure.
So does anybody have a question for Nitin? I know that there are 2 mics on either side. Yay, house lights. So if you do have a question, just put your hand up.
Somebody at the back has got their hand up.
Yay, somebody at the back. Thank you for seeing. Thank you for being my seeing line man. Hello.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi. Perfectly.
My name is Bianca. I'm from South Africa.
Hi, Bianca.
I just want to ask, what is your relationship with reference music in a film, when you get your picture-locked film? Or do you prefer working on a blank canvas? And have you ever been in a position where you've been given a product and gone, here's a blank canvas, show us what you got?
The Lodger, for example, was where I was establishing my own vocabulary, as I was saying, and also the other silent movies that I've done had no director who was living to work with. And then there was no temp score, obviously, to those. Those are just literally rendered silent movies from the 20s and so on. But in terms of temp score, which is what I call reference music, temp score. It's actually, as I was saying before, it's, I work with it quite closely, and I will look at it, but I don't necessarily always allow myself to be influenced by it. It depends on whether I feel I can bring, I'll use it to understand the mindset of the director or the producer or whoever's put that, or the editor, whoever's put that on the film. By temp score, let me just really clarify what that is. So it's just literally music that is selected by a combination normally of the director and the editor, and they'll select music for the film that they think may work in a given scene, and then that informs how you approach the music. So yes, it's a combination. Sometimes I'll refer to it quite extensively if it's a director who's very attached to that, and then sometimes I'll kind of find my own way in and my own way of working with it.
Thank you, Bianca. A gentleman in the middle here. I think it's a gentleman. Yes, there you go. Hello. I was just about to change your sex. I did apologise for my
that's okay. It happens to me all the time. I wanted to know, obviously you've been doing this a long time and the technology has changed drastically. You mentioned Logic, which was, from eMagic. It was purchased years ago by Apple. So how's things changed for you as far as composing and being a musician from the days of having a whole room full of, say, synthesizers shrinking down to just a hard disk drive and a laptop?
That's a really good question, actually. I remember in the early days when I was first writing music for, say, the BBC, I remember, having a video recorder, and I'd have my my keyboards, and just and a sequencer which was built into the keyboard, and a recording device. And what I'd be doing, and sometimes there's just a DAT machine, digital audio tape. So I was I'd be playing the video recorder and trying to kind of play stuff as fast as I could, or press the sequencer so it matched up as close as it could to the frames. So I had, nowadays you have QuickTime movies which you can import into Logic, and you've got everything beautifully synchronized and so on. It was quite a pain in the ass doing at that time, and it just was mad. It just added to the kind of craziness of everything. But I think also, computers have massively changed how you approach things, and the possibilities of how you can really achieve an orchestral score very quickly. By obviously with Sibelius, all the parts can be printed out very quickly, very fast, and you don't have to individually by hand write those parts out, which I had done, in years gone by when I used to write for orchestras a long time ago, not necessarily connected with film.
Is there ever any sense? Thank you for your question, by the way.
Yeah.
Is there ever any sense amongst the musical community that using so much technology is going to put an orchestra out of business or other musicians?
It's something that I really, really kind of think about a lot, and I always prefer to use orchestra where there's a budget to use an orchestra. I mean, it can be quite prohibitive if you know there just isn't that budget, and you are left in a dilemma, because as a composer your job is to deliver what as close as possible to the vision of the director, but where the director where, for example, you're given, and this has happened to me, where I've been given a very small budget in time gone by, and then they will ask you to do something, and then you think, okay, I'm going to do electronic type score. And then what they give you on the temp score is all Hans Zimmer from The Dark Knight or something like that. And so it's like, yeah, how am I going to do that? It's got a massive orchestra. But yeah, I mean, you try and find your way in, and actually, in a way, it makes you raise your game, because you have to think. I mean, Ennio Morricone, for example, he did those incredible spaghetti western scores for Sergio Leone. Because they came out the way they did, because they didn't have an orchestral budget, and he built his own vocabulary and his own sounds, and used and found very clever ways of creating beautiful, unique ambiences and flavors, because he didn't actually have access to an orchestra.
Isn't that how the whistle came about?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
and
that little whistle was because he didn't have anything else that he.
Yeah,
could
and
use
he used avant-garde kind of singers and orchestras.
Anybody else got a question for Nitin Sawhney? A lady over here, coming down to you. Hi.
Hi. Nitin, thank you, first of all, for the music you have composed so far. I just wonder what your current passion in music was.
Oh, wow. My current passion in music is, blimey. Well, it's always, I always love flamenco. I'm a huge fan of flamenco guitar, so I still love listening back to Paco de Lucier's guitar playing. I was absolutely gutted when he passed away. I also was privileged enough to know Pandit G. Ravi Shankar, so I'm a great fan of listening to his music. But I'll listen to all kinds of. It depends what I'm doing. I mean, sometimes in terms of what I'm passionate about, that may not be what I'm listening to, because I may be listening to music for reference for what I'm working with. But I'm passionate about Miles Davis. I'm passionate about great rock bands. There's so much music that I'm passionate about. So there's very little music that I'm probably not passionate about. If it's played beautifully or it's executed well, then I probably am passionate about it in some way.
What about country music?
Well, actually, Albert Lee is one of my favourite. He's a great guitarist. If you listen to Country Boy, fantastic guitar playing. So yeah, I mean, that's
I have
very
nothing against country music. I was just trying to be funny. Who else has a question for Nitin? Over there on. Okay, brilliant. Hello.
Hi, Nitin.
Hi.
So I'm a medic and a musician, and I'm interested in the collaboration between the two. With the Breathe soundtrack, did you take any inspiration from the human body and the sounds, not the sounds that you might think traditionally, but the breath sounds or the
what a great
ventilator?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said in a couple of interviews recently, one in Toronto, I was saying that the respirator was actually like a witness to what was going on, but it was also it was a double-edged sword, because it was his lifeline, and it's also this kind of dark kind of witness that is hovering over him all the time, and feels threatening, like a Darth Vader type of mask. And so there's something that feels ominous about it constantly, but at the same time it's also saving his life. So I was very conscious of it all the time, and you have to work around it or work with it, and so it will at times dictate the tempo of the music as well. There were a couple of scenes where I was acutely aware of it and the tempo of the breathing, so that you actually use that to kind of build your orchestral sound.
Guys, that's all we've got time for, unless somebody's got something gentleman there, very last question, then. I'm so sorry we've run out of time, but we'll take your question. Hi.
Very quickly then.
Yeah.
The scene in the film, For those who don't know it, I'm sorry, but there is a scene with flamenco in.
Yeah.
Was that originally there, or did it come in with you?
Right, so there's some flamenco which is actually what's it called, diegetic, is it? where it's actually it's part of what's going on, and then there's some flamenco which is me playing. So there's a bit where it kind of you come into Spain, so that's me actually playing some flamenco guitar to establish Spain, but actually bouncing off some great jazz players that I brought into the studio as well. So we kind of we did that pretty much live. So yeah, I mean, some of it is me, some of it is actually the players who were there as well.
Thank you all so very much for being here this afternoon. And if you want more information about any of the BFI LFF Connect, you can just go to the BFI website, and you can follow Nitin on Twitter at the Nitin Sawhney, and visit his website for information about what he's doing next. Nitin, thank you. It's been a huge honour.
Thank you. Same to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.